From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Capitol Hill to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Hordern, I'm Caitlin Lyons.
It's Election Day across the United States, with the presidential election a full year away. On the ballot today, abortion in Ohio, 2 governor seats, and potential clues into what may happen next year.
And then there's what happens next week. The deadline to avert a government shutdown just days away. We'll speak with Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee and Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana.
And 1 month after Hamas's deadly massacre in Israel, today the Israeli military saying they're deep in Gaza, but no endgame in sight. We'll speak with Ghaith Al-Omari, former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. All right, a lot coming up on this show, Kay. There's also going to be a vigil here on, at Capitol Hill in terms of what happened 1 month today in Israel. But of course, a lot is happening on Capitol Hill. 11 days away from a government shutdown. At the same time, it's an off-year election, but a very important one across the river.
Yeah, in Virginia, where the House of Delegates and the state Senate, all of it's up for grabs. And of course, the Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, is really trying to cement control of the Virginia state legislature. But that's not the only race we're watching today. Abortion is on the ballot in Ohio. There's some noteworthy gubernatorial ones as well. So we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, we do. So let's bring in our expert panel. Bloomberg's senior editor, Wendy Benjaminson, and Mike Dorning join us right here on Capitol Hill. Wendy, let's start with you. So a ton of races to watch out for. What I find so fascinating about Virginia is Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy says it's the only one to look out for, because what happens this evening for Glenn Youngkin could path a different future for the Republican presidential election, whether it's 2024 or 2028.
Absolutely. Glenn Youngkin tonight is not on the ballot himself, but he needs to flip 3 seats in the state Senate so that Republicans have total control over the Virginia government. Otherwise, right now, the Democrats have the Senate and Republicans have the House. If his campaigning was successful and he can flip those 3 seats to the Republican side, one of the things he will do is enact a 15-week ban on abortion, which is a really interesting position because, as we know, governors in Texas and Florida and other very conservative states have gone to 6-week or 8-week bans. 15 weeks is a sort of split down the middle kind of position, and he will do that. But that will test whether he is a viable presidential candidate. If not this year, then almost certainly in 2028, or at least there will be pressure on him to do so in 2028.
And of course, abortion is really a common denominator across a lot of these elections today. As I said, it's literally on the ballot in Ohio with issue 1. Are we about to find out if it still has the same potency, the ability to drive turnout as in the immediate aftermath of Roe versus Wade being overturned?
Exactly, Kaylee. That's what we're watching for tonight. If in Ohio there is a constitutional amendment to enshrine abortion rights in the ballot, it looks like it might pass because earlier this year there was a special election in which anti-abortion activists put on the ballot something to make it harder to pass a constitutional amendment. Everyone knew that was an effort to stop this abortion referendum, and that failed. So they have the numbers they need, and if people turn out and vote in a special election, then that might be enshrined in the Ohio Constitution. And Ohio is a Trump Republican state.
Well, it'll be a big nod to President Biden if people go out and vote for abortion, because it's the one area he is still leading in the polls. When you look at the latest New York Times, Siena poll, the former president, Donald Trump, is eating away at Biden when it comes to the economy, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to things like abortion. The Democrats still have a stronghold. Yes. How are you looking at these off elections and what the tea leaves may tell us about next year?
Well, the interesting thing, Virginia will be the only place that's really a good look at 2024 presidential election. And the key there is ex-urban voters and the sort of suburban voters that are a little further out, slightly less urban parts of suburban areas. And there'll be a key swing constituency next time, and they are the key to the Virginia legislative races. So we'll see how that's going. The one thing is you just need to take all of this with a grain of salt, because the world will change in a year. Typically, a year ahead of an election, an incumbent president is weaker. Trump will be going through some criminal trials that might weaken him. On the other hand, there's stuff going on in the Mideast that poses risks both to the Democratic coalition and to the U.S. economy that could make things worse for Biden. So it's an interesting X-ray, particularly about this one decisive, important group of voters, but it's just a check of how they're doing right now.
What about some of the gubernatorial races, like in Kentucky, where Andy Beshear is a Democratic incumbent in a state that went for Trump by a wide margin in the last presidential election, and yet his Republican challenger is essentially trying to make the gubernatorial race about national politics and say, hey, Beshear is in the same camp as President Biden? Or isn't that kind of a signal about the issue of a low-polling incumbent Democratic president and what it may mean for Democratic incumbents down the ballot?
It certainly tells you what Republicans in Kentucky think is their best play against Beshear's. But Beshear's has been a pretty popular Democratic governor who's managed to rise above these partisan differences and has his own personal following in Kentucky. So even if he survives and does well, that doesn't necessarily tell you that much about Biden's prospects a year down the road, in my view.
Well, he's a unicorn. And if he's able to win again, do you think he has higher political ambitions?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Wendy. She follows national politics more closely than I do.
Wendy?
On that.
There is no politician
He
who wins a
to
lot
hold
and
a red
doesn't
state?
have ambitions. If you're a politician, you're ambitious for higher office. So yes, there's also Mississippi, but Mississippi, where a Democrat is competitive for the governorship of Mississippi, which would be unheard of in 50 years. However, in this case, it's not as much of a bellwether because the Republican Governor Tate Reeves has been sidelined with corruption allegations, stealing or misappropriating welfare money, things like that. And so if a Democrat wins, it will be more a statement about Tate Reeves than it is about national Republicans.
Fascinating. And of course, we're all sitting here on Capitol Hill tonight, where there is a certain lack of progress forward in terms of keeping the government funded, sorting out aid to not just Israel, but Ukraine as well. How much does the relative dysfunction in the building behind us color the way voters are thinking when they go to the polls, Mike?
My instinct is not that much. I think they're more focused on perceptions of Biden as a leader, abortion, and perceptions of the economy. Something that really struck me was I just saw some data today on how much extra debt younger Americans have taken on, and that's the same group of people that you see have lost some of their enthusiasm for Biden. So it's really the economics that's weighing on people at the moment. This turmoil here at the moment, in my view, probably will not necessarily have a big impact either now or in 2024. But the divisions within the Republican Party and their potential to create further tumult during the year is the big risk for Republicans going into 2024. So less about what happens right now than what these splits and fighting and dysfunction tells you about what might happen further down the road.
Wendy, do you agree?
Yes, I do. I think that that's absolutely the case. These sort of little kerfuffles that go on right now don't last that long. In a year from now, even if the government does shut down in a week or so, in 10 days, then by November of 24, if the government's up and running, people will be mad that it's running, not that it's not shut down. And that's what they'll focus on. But I think there are also divisions right now in the Democratic Party that are creating headwinds for President Biden right now. Divisions over his full-throated support for Israel, divisions over student debt, over missed promises. And that is affecting not only young people, but the black voters who put him in office in 2020.
All right, Wendy Benjaminson and Mike Dorning, our Bloomberg panel tonight. Thank you both so much for joining us. So let's continue the conversation about a government shutdown that now could just be about 10 or 11 days away as House Republicans are scrambling to come up with a funding plan. The new Speaker, Mike Johnson, discussed the possibility of what he calls a laddered approach earlier today.
With regard to the ladder CR, or maybe a two-tiered CR, it's one of the ideas that has been discussed. There's nothing magical or mysterious about it. It would just be effectively two phases. You would do one part, a subset of the bills by a December date, and the rest of it by a January date. The other alternative is a CR that would go into January with certain stipulations. But again, I'm not going to show you all the cards right now. We have some very constructive and I think very positive discussions going on. I think it should be palatable to our colleagues in the Senate.
Joining us now is one of those colleagues in the Senate, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Senator, thank you very much for joining us this evening. What is the Senate going to be able to agree to that the House can swallow?
Well, we haven't seen what it's going to be, so it's hard for us to say what we could agree to. And obviously, Chuck Schumer is the leader, majority leader here, and Mike Johnson, a great friend and a fellow Louisianian, is over there. Mm-hmm. So you're asking me a little bit to look at the Ouija board, and I'd like to see at least a few of the cards before I kind of comment upon your attempt to answer your question.
But Senator, do you think that we could potentially see this government shutdown, 12:01 Saturday of next week?
I think that the House Republicans and the Senate in general are committed to the government not shutting down. For many reasons, I don't think it will. Or if it does, it'll shut down for 8 hours or something like that. Now, if I knew for sure, obviously I'd be looking at palms on Bourbon Street right now giving fortunes. So no one can know for sure, but I think there is a commitment from both sides, from Speaker Johnson and from the Senate, not to have a government shutdown. How that works out, I can't tell you, but I do think that's a commitment.
Well, so then it just becomes a question of how the different chambers are going to go about it, Senator. There's been a lot of conversation about things being packaged together on the Senate side, where the House is really trying to pursue single subject bills. How big do you think a potential multitude of minibuses or ultimately a megabus is going to be on the Senate side? What would you be okay with?
I'm not sure the House has shut the door on having a minibus, if you will. And for those watching who don't know what that means, an omnibus would be every spending bill all packaged into one, and a minibus would be 2, 3, or 4. So I think that the House might be open to a minibus. But again, there's a commitment, for example, to fund the military. The military has got lots of challenges around the world, and they don't want to continue to operate under last year's spending priorities. They've asked for updates. Congress has waited on updates. The military wishes to have the ability to respond to today's challenges, not those from a year ago. I think it's very reasonable. Again, Speaker Johnson has 2 military bases in his district, one Fort Johnson, formerly called Fort Polk. The other is Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier. And so he is going to be sensitive to that. And that's just one example of why it's important to get a spending bill reflecting new priorities in a changing world, as opposed to merely continuing that which was from last year.
Well, speaking of the military, we heard from Senator Tommy Tuberville today, and he said, quote, "I want to get this over with." This is in terms of resolving the blockade he's put in Congress, in the Senate, on those military officials that the Senate is waiting to take votes on. Can you tell us, is there any impact now on the impasse? Is he going to remove that blockade?
Well, the meeting is still going on, and I'll let Senator Tuberville speak for himself. Since it's still going on and I had to break for this in another meeting, I don't feel comfortable kind of giving, before the meeting's over, what's being said. But he would like to have it over. It's pretty clear from the discussion that we've had so far is that the administration kind of manufactured this. This was not intended to be DOD policy. The DOD policy they had before was working pretty well. And Coach Tuberville, he goes by Coach, feels as if the administration kind of set this up to be the cause that it is. But nonetheless, we're looking for solutions as to how it could resolve. By the way, there's only 12 people affected by this policy. And initially, the military had said it would be as many as 4,000. I can tell you that. So they put out a policy which was going to affect 4,000 people, kind of inviting a response from Coach Tuberville's perspective. So there's some areas to give on both sides, and I think he's very interested in seeing it resolved.
Well, Senator, as you look for a resolution on that issue, and I understand you don't want to pre-conclude the conclusion of the meeting if you had to step out of it, but what would your message be to the senator now when there are many officials who are saying that this is a national security issue that is impacting U.S. military readiness? I understand that he's the coach, but you're a member of his team, right? Do you have any sway over this?
Well, a couple things. First, I'd like to see it resolved. Let me just say that. And I do think that the people being punished are the people that have no role in this. I would like the person at Barksdale Air Force Base to get a promotion, and then that would trigger many other promotions behind him. So let me just first stipulate that. Secondly, I will point out that General Milley in September, the outgoing Joint Chief of Staff chairman, said that our military readiness is fine. So I don't want to have people panicking that military readiness has suffered because the people who are waiting on those promotions are deserving. They should get it, but they're also professionals and they're going to continue to do their job. And I'm just assuming that from what General Milley said. But then going forward, I don't want to underestimate it either. I would like to see this resolved. I would like to see those who are in queue to get promoted to be promoted. And I do think that that would benefit us in many ways. So I'm not giving you an answer, but that meeting's still going on.
All right, well, we look forward to finding out what's happening in that closed-door meeting. Senator, I'm also going to be traveling with the president next week when he is set to meet with Xi Jinping on the side of APEC. And you're calling for a pollution fee when it comes out of China. How would this work? And wouldn't this end up impacting the cost of goods on U.S. consumers, thus being a tax?
So a couple things. I am introducing a foreign pollution fee. If you look at what happens now, the United States enforces environmental standards, which somewhat increases the cost of manufacturing. China does not enforce those environmental standards by and large, which decreases their cost of manufacturing. That incentivizes companies to set up their manufacturing units in China. And China uses that economic growth to fuel its military and its foreign policy kind of policies and strategies. That's bad for the United States. One, it's bad because we're losing the jobs. It's bad because now China emits 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions all over the world. And it's bad because the resulting economic strength from polluting and stealing jobs is now being used to fund their military adventures. What we would do is just level the playing field. Put a fee roughly commensurate with the avoided cost of actually trying to enforce environmental regulations. So if this is how much we have to pay as an industry for a certain type of good, then that's what the fee would be on that good coming over from China. We think it is a peaceful way by which to rein in a way by the unfair trade practices that is fueling their military growth, and therefore a peaceful way to decrease the risk of war going forward. In terms of increasing cost upon U.S. consumers, I frankly think that it won't be. One, because China can get out from underneath the fees. All they have to do is lower their greenhouse gas emission profile. They just have to adopt international norms, however they wish to do so, in terms of how much pollution they generate. If they do that, well, they may have an increased cost of compliance because an increased cost of a good because they're complying with international norms. But isn't that a good thing? We pay a little extra for products here because we don't want polluted waters and we don't want polluted ocean and we don't want polluted air. Why shouldn't China do the same thing? So we think our foreign pollution fee is totally commensurate with free market economics. We are taxing an externality.
All right, Senator, we look forward to tracking your bill, and we'll see what comes out of that meeting with President Biden and Xi Jinping. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, thank you for your time. Coming up, Congressman Fleischmann will be joining us right here on Capitol Hill. This is Bloomberg.
As our cherished friend and ally Israel fights for its survival against the Iran-backed terrorists of Hamas, we will continue to stand up for human dignity and offer moral clarity. House Republicans understand that this moment demands decisive action, and we insist that we cannot waste any more time getting Israel the aid that it desperately needs.
House Speaker Mike Johnson stressing the need for more aid to Israel while speaking to reporters earlier today. And joining us now is Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann from Tennessee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. And actually, just behind us right now is this vigil to mark this 1 month on from this massacre of Hamas on these Israeli citizens. So obviously, the House passed their own version of an Israeli aid bill, but it doesn't seem like the Senate wants to take that bill on board. They want to make a lot of amendments to it. How long is this process going to take?
I don't know how long it's going to take, but I will say this. There is a bipartisan and bicameral resolve to make sure that Israel gets the funding it needs to protect itself. That's the good news. The difficult news is we don't know what form that will ultimately take. The House did a couple things. First of all, we passed a resolution. It's the first thing we passed after we got a speaker. That was a very, very strong statement. So the resolution was out there. The bill that was coupled, which I voted for, with the cutting of the IRS funds, obviously did not play well in the United States Senate. But we need to send a clear message to the world. Israel will get its funding. It will be robust. And we need to make sure that we continue to tell not only the American people, but the world that Israel is our ally. Israel was wronged on October the 7th by terrorists. That can never be condoned. And we need to stand by our only true, real, great ally in the Middle East.
So, Congressman, I have kind of a two-part question for you. Would you say the U.S.'s support for Israel should be unconditional?
When we say unconditional, it needs to be strong. Our rhetoric needs to match our dollars. Absolutely. We need to talk about the fact that the survival and the prosperity of the Jewish state is important not only to people in Israel, but to the United States. Israel is our ally. When you say unconditional, I think we always need to know where the money is going. For example, when we talk about Ukraine funding, I don't think we can let Putin win. He's a thug. He has caused all kinds of problems in that region. It's horrible what he did in Ukraine. But the American people want accountability. If we're going to commit U.S. tax dollars to Israel, to Ukraine, anywhere in the world, even to our other allies, such as Egypt, our second largest recipient of aid, we need to know where those dollars are going. The American people want the answers, and they deserve the answers to those questions.
So you think there should be conditions in the receiving of aid in terms of how it's used, but I wonder about attaching conditions of our own to aid, like making sure it's paid for by stripping funds from the IRS. Is that really appropriate?
Well, it's a start. Let's face it, the bill that created 80,000 new IRS agents was ridiculous. I voted against that. I don't think the American people want that. I can remember vividly and finally debating the Democrats on the floor. I said, look, I'll stand with the American people. You Democrats stand with the IRS. And they actually embraced that. I could not believe we were hearing Democrats staying with the IRS on that.
But the CBO says that it's actually going to add to the deficit. Do you not agree with the Congressional Budget Office?
I don't agree with them. Okay, I am a firm believer, first of all, we need to reduce taxes in this country, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. Thank God I live in a state, one of 9, Tennessee, with no state income tax. People are coming to states with no state income tax. But I go back to John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, who will say, reduce taxes and you'll get actually more revenue in the Treasury. Why? You will have growth. But that's my ethos. But the reality is we don't need more IRS agents. I would look forward to a day when we would favor more consumptive taxes rather than income taxes. I don't think anybody should be punished on their ability to earn, but that's my ethos.
So, Congressman, we only have about a minute left, but that's on the revenue side. In terms of the spending side of the ledger, that's a conversation clearly you are all deeply engaged in right now. Right. What kind of continuing resolution would find your support?
Well, I'm a firm believer that, and I'm an appropriator, that we have got to keep the government open. So I'm not putting some of the conditions that some of my friends in my caucus are. I think something that is a little bit longer, cleaner, less complex. Excuse me?
Longer meaning April?
No, probably January. No one's talking April, but we're talking January. I could live with December if we had to. Logistics are going to be a problem. But the more staggered or complex you make it a non-starter in the Senate. We've got to send a message right now to the world. We do not want to shut the American government down. We want to keep it open. There's two major wars going on. We've got problems at home. We don't need to be shutting down the American government.
All right, well, the clock's ticking, so you only have a few days left to work that out. Congressman Chuck Fleischmann, thank you very much for joining us. Of course, the Republican from Tennessee. Now, coming up, we're going to turn to Election Day across the country and dive more deeply into some of these closely watched races from just across the river in Virginia to Kentucky, Ohio, and beyond. So stick with us live from Capitol Hill this evening. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
You can't be like some of these Republicans, many of them in Washington, D.C., that refuse to fight for our values. In Florida, and what Kim has done here in Iowa tells a different story.
We need a president who has the skill and the resolve to reverse the madness that we see every single day. That leader is Ron DeSantis.
That was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, who just gave him her endorsement for 2024. Let's bring in Christy Setzer now, president and founder of New Heights Communications. And Christy, as we look ahead to the race or the election that comes basically a year from now, there's also a number of elections that are happening today in an off year. Usually they're not all that exciting, but it seems like they could send some pretty firm signals as to what's to come in 2024. What are you watching this evening?
Yeah, so one thing that is definitely going to be potentially a signal for next year is the issue of abortion. We've seen ever since the Dobbs decision last summer, we've seen Democrats overperform in these special elections, not just because of turnout among Democrats, but also because of persuasion among independents and even probably some Republicans. So the question tonight will be if we see that again across the board, not just in states where it's explicitly on the ballot, like in Ohio, but also in states where it's sort of tangentially on the ballot, like in Pennsylvania, where they're electing a Supreme Court justice. So that's the first thing I think that I'm going to be looking for is, do we continue to see this overperformance for Democrats expressly because of the issue on abortion?
When it comes to the national polls, though, Americans continue to rank the economy, including inflation, as their number one concern. And the former President Trump is eating away at Biden's advantage when it comes to that. The Biden administration seems to have a trust deficit on the economy of the American people.
Yeah.
Would abortion be enough for that to become more of a top issue than, say, inflation and consumer prices that's weighing on their purchasing power?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I think that when voters go to the polls in a year, certainly they're going to be weighing all of those issues, as they are tonight. But where we're seeing in states like Virginia, where you have a Republican governor who has said that he will embrace a 15-week ban on abortion, which again, he says is sort of a moderate compromise position, is nevertheless still a ban on abortion. And I don't think that there's a majority of voters who are aching for some sort of ban on abortion, right? They do want people to be worried about the economy and other issues instead of that. So it's actually, I would argue in many places, the Republicans who are showing their hands in terms of this is what their true priorities are. It's not about, solving inflation. It is about, culture war stuff.
Well, Christy, Anne-Marie mentioned how President Biden is struggling on the issue of the economy, but also other issues, even some foreign policy. Former President Trump has an edge on him if they indeed are going to be matched up in a general election. And actually, the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was asked about some of these polls and whether President Biden was aware of exactly where he's standing. This is what she said earlier today.
We have to really take these polls with a grain of salt, as we should really be very mindful here. And one of the reasons why is just a year ago, right, back in 2022, there was the red wave that never materialized. I'll take it even further. In 2011, this time in 2011, we saw Senator Romney, we saw polls of Senator Romney beating President Obama.
So we know a lot can change in the span of a year.
Yep.
So then I guess to circle back to my original question, is what happens in November 2023 really at all a firm tell on November 2024, even on the issue of abortion? Because we're going to be another year further out from the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the time people vote for president.
That's true. But again, if, people keep putting it on the ballot, keep proactively taking stands on it, then it keeps it top of mind for people. Look, I don't disagree with what Karine said today. I do think that we have consistently seen, Democrats be underestimated the year before the polls. I think that, look, if we want to be cute about it, we can say that if you're feeling good about the election tonight, then you're going to say that it's very predictive of what happens in a year. If you're not feeling good about it, you're going to say these are all local elections. They're completely different from the national, what's happening nationally. I would say both because I feel good about tonight, but also in general, that elections tend to be more nationalized these days. So I do think that there is predictive power tonight in what we're going to see in a year. Maybe, again, one other example that we can give across the river in Virginia is that Youngkin has also had some challenges on democracy issues. We saw that he tried to get thousands of people misclassified as felons that would be ineligible to vote tonight. That was, there was a ton of press about that, and then he, backtracked on it. So I would never have guessed, let's say a decade ago, that top of mind issues for Democrats, but voters generally would be democracy and abortion. But, again, here we are.
If Glenn Youngkin is able to turn Virginia full red tonight, what does that say to you about his future? Is this a potential last-minute effort to get in now for 2024, or do you think he sits it out and waits for maybe a 2028 run?
Well, I mean, certainly that is the narrative that he's trying to put, is that there is a place for a moderate in the Republican Party. That's how he got
donors are trying to put out there.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, right? And so, I mean, clearly that would bring a lot of wind to the sails of that argument. I still don't know that I buy it, though. I still think that, moderates in the party are a rare breed and incredibly outnumbered, and not just outnumbered in terms of electeds, but outnumbered in terms of just where the base of the party is and who's actually getting rewarded for that, for taking a moderate position. So, I think he can make that argument, but I think that he would still ultimately be quite unsuccessful if in fact he were to get in.
Well, and that begs the question of everyone else who is competing for the Republican nomination. 5 of them are going to be on the debate stage in Miami tomorrow. Nikki Haley, ascendant. Ron DeSantis, very much not so. There will probably be a lot of focus on the two of them. And yet, no matter how you slice it, it's former President Donald Trump who is far and away the front runner. So why are we doing this?
Why are we even doing this? I mean, democratic principles,
Small thing.
Sure. But I agree, of course, with that analysis, which is that there is really no one who is really even figuring into the conversation other than Donald Trump. This is a contest between Donald Trump and himself.
Right, and also one nuance in that New York Times Siena poll is actually, if he is convicted, it does look like a lot of those voters that potentially were for him are actually going to just flock away. So we have a year out. Christy Setzer, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Coming back, we turn back to the war between Israel and Hamas and what's next for the people of Gaza.
You have to go after the Palestinian Authority and really empower them. They have to be empowered so that the Palestinian people say, this is real this time.
Up next, we'll be joined by Ghaith Al-Omari, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, to discuss the Israel-Hamas war that's still ahead right here on Bloomberg.
We need to get our trucks in, and we can't do that unless we can be guaranteed safe and unfettered access. There's no water, there's no food, there's no medicine, there's no fuel. We all know that. People are dying in there, and so it's up to us to put the pressure on to make sure that our humanitarian agencies can get in there and get in there safely.
That was Cindy McCain, Executive Director of the World Food Program, with us yesterday. For more, let's bring in Ghaith Al-Omari, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you so much for joining us. You're also an advisor to the Palestinian Authority. You know this issue so well. So Cindy McCain was talking about the horrific humanitarian situation right now in Gaza. But we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu today, and I want you to hear what he had to say about the security situation and its future under potentially in Israeli hands. He was on ABC World News. Take a listen.
Who should govern Gaza when this is over? those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas, it certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
What's the difference for the security responsibility versus reoccupying Gaza again?
I think what the Prime Minister is trying to say is that they will go out of Gaza, but maintain the right to go in whenever they feel that they need to go in. Now, that's problematic. I mean, that's problematic because at the end of the day, no government that will be in Gaza after the war will accept to basically sit there and be just, bystanders for Israel to go in and out. But I think this is what he has in mind, because no Israeli that I know, and I've been speaking to people on the left, right, and center, no one wants to go back and reoccupy Gaza permanently. But I think what Netanyahu was saying is he wants to maintain the security control, but not the civilian and other kind of control.
Okay, so if no one really wants reoccupation, it becomes a question of what realistically is the long-term game plan here. What is optimal, and is there in the Venn diagram something that is both optimal and realistic?
This is actually the question that is on every policymaker's mind today here in the States and throughout, because there are no good options. No one wants Hamas to remain. Hamas is a terror organization. It's a threat not only to Israel, but frankly to Arab countries, and I would even argue to the Palestinians themselves. Yet the Palestinian Authority is too weak, too discredited to come and do the job. So everyone now is talking about having some sort of an international mechanism, body, agency to run it, but that's also problematic. No country wants to send troops to shoot at Palestinians, to be shot at Palestinians. No country wants to be there when Israel wants to maintain its security control. So today we have no optimal option, but I think where the center of gravity today is a push towards an international mechanism with a strong Arab participation, but we're still at the very, very early stages of this conversation.
Will they sign up for it? I'm guessing you're talking about the Emiratis, the Saudis.
Emiratis, Saudis,
Jordanians,
and Egyptians are really the biggest candidates. They are very, very concerned. I mean, for them, they don't want to be stuck in the Palestinian issue. For them, they see this as political quicksand. I mean, an Arab diplomat was telling me yesterday, look at what happened with the U.S. in Iraq. We went in, we're stuck there. They don't want to be in that position. And they don't want to be in a position as well to be accused of basically usurping the Palestinian issue, undermining Palestinian rights. So there's a very, very heavy lift to convince them to come in.
But Mahmoud Abbas is 87 years old. What does it look like politically down the line? Is there a young, bright leader? Is there a successor? Because it feels like all of those people have been tamped down.
Look, there is no shortage of young, talented Palestinians. However, Abbas, as a matter of policy, has decided to undermine every person who emerges. We had, for example, a prime minister named Salam Fayyad, who was an amazing reformer by the, admission of the U.S. government, of the IMF, of the World Bank. Abbas cut him down. I think a key point to look at once the war is over in Gaza, we should not only focus on Gaza, we should focus on reforming the Palestinian Authority to ensure that the kind of talented, capable, clean leaders who exist have a chance to compete and ultimately rule the Palestinian people. At the end of the day, no one but the Palestinians can govern the Palestinians. It is up to us to help, support, and encourage those reformist Palestinians.
What role does the U.S. play in that? What would you be advising the administration to pursue here?
First of all, I would advise the administration in the short term to make sure that we focus on the humanitarian aspects of what's happening in Gaza. Israel's right to defend itself is beyond doubt. Yet, if you do not respect protect the civilians, then it's very hard to maintain diplomatic support for Israel. So that's on the short term. On the longer term, I would say take a page from the playbook of George W. Bush. When George W. Bush came to us, and I was a Palestinian official at that point, and said to us, you will not get anything, no diplomatic support, no financial support, until you reform, until you deal with corruption, until you deal with these issues. We had no choice but to start reforming. So I think for me, as I look at this administration, short term, make sure that civilians are protected. Long term, approach this holistically, make sure that the Palestinian Authority is rehabilitated. And of course, that requires Israel also to shift some of its own policies that undermine the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian moderates.
What do you make of the blowback this administration is seeing? The protest that happened over the weekend. I walked into the White House and there was red paint supposed to imagine blood handprints on White House property. And we've passed 10,000 civilian deaths in Gaza. These are innocent Palestinian people.
I mean, the numbers, I think the 10,000 includes some Hamas fighters, but even if it's 3, 4, 5,000, I mean, the images coming out of Gaza are brutal. And no matter what the kind of policy justification for them, the human side of it is so much so that it is actually just heartbreaking. And it's not only here. I mean, look at Arab capitals. There are demonstrations every day. Arab leaders are feeling under pressure. And that is, to my mind, that is extremely legitimate. And if you don't sympathize, then there's something missing. Yet, what concerns me is that some very radical elements are also trying to hijack this, whether it's geostrategically, we look at the Iranians, you look at countries like Qatar and Turkey, which support Hamas, they're trying to hijack it. And in our own conversation here in the United States, unfortunately, I see some marginal groups which are pushing not only for pro-Palestinian agendas, which I'm totally supportive of, but sometimes anti-Semitic, sometimes anti-Israel. So while we need to continue, I think, protesting and showing empathy with the Palestinians, we have to be very careful that this, I think, noble cause is not hijacked by people for agendas that will not do good for the Palestinians to start with and for our own country here.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening, providing your perspective and insight. We really appreciate it. That's Ghaith Al-Omari. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, we'll turn from the conflict between Israel and Hamas to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's energy minister will be joining us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Ukraine's energy chief is here in Washington meeting lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in efforts to bolster the country's energy supplies and infrastructure. This, of course, as Congress weighs another multi-billion aid package for Kyiv. Joining us now is Ukraine's energy minister, Herman Galushchenko. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
So yesterday you met with administration officials. Today you met with senators. Are you getting the feeling that America is still going to support Ukraine, even though there's a big debate on how much they're willing to continue to send over to Kyiv as you continue to fight this war with Russia?
Absolutely. So I can tell you that during all the meetings, we discussed that is a crucial issue because our fight it's not only the question of the fight between Ukraine and Russia. That's a question of the democracy and the values. And that is really a battlefield. And that is a part of the civilized world and another part of the world. That's why I think it's very important. And we discuss a lot of things like the support to the energy sector. You know that the previous winter we were under everyday attacks to the energy from the 10th of October until the 9th of March. And they are trying to destroy the energy system of Ukraine. And so we expected that they would repeat this winter also, this attempt. So that's why it's critically important to support Ukraine.
So how prepared is the Ukrainian energy system for this winter that is rapidly approaching, if not already arrived?
I can tell you that this year we realized the biggest repairing campaign in the history of the country because the previous winter they managed to destroy a lot of facilities. That is generation facilities, that is transmission, substation. But we're ready, so we are quite ready. And of course, everything would be depend on the level of attacks, and I might say even the level of influence of this attack, of impact of this attack to our infrastructure, whether the damages and destruction would be huge or not.
So are you worried about blackouts, prolonged blackouts? Are you worried about securing a nuclear facility like Zaporizhia?
Oh, that's a difficult question because, you know, I really do not have an answer. What is the red lines for Russians? So do they at least try to attack directly the nuclear stations? I don't know the answer. And of course, we are worried about this. So because for this winter, all Ukrainian-controlled reactors would be on operation for the whole winter period. But we already, the previous week, there were some drone attacks not far from Khmelnytskyi and PP, and we don't know whether they target directly the station or just missed, or maybe some other, but it's anyway have the impact on the nuclear fleet. And I must say that that is the more dangerous situation which could happen if they would try to attack the nuclear stations.
Does Ukraine right now have adequate air defense to protect power stations from those kind of attacks?
We have better defense this winter than we had before the next one. And of course, we received more modern systems from our partners, first of all, from the United States, from some European countries. But we need to increase. We need to increase because my answer to the question what we can do to help, I can just have one answer. Please help us with the air defense. So that is the best way to protect the energy infrastructure, and the energy influence all other spheres in the country. So from the energy, the economy depends dramatically. So we have to protect the energy.
And was this your message to Washington?
Yeah, and that is not only let's say our feeling about this. So because we just expected the EU report on Ukraine accession to EU, and they mentioned that due to the stability of supply during this year of the energy, during the summer, the end of spring, the autumn, so the economy start growing, and that is very important.
Absolutely.
All right, Minister, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time joining us here in Washington, of course, after a day of meetings on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much for being here. And of course, Anne-Marie, not just a day in which we are considering conflict in Ukraine and Israel as well, but when voters are getting ready, if they haven't already, to race to the polls before they close.
Yeah, absolutely. Some key states that are going to the polls, the most important one really being Virginia. Everyone still is whispering potentially could there be a Glenn Youngkin run. But really, what does all of this mean for the presidential race next year, November of 2024?
Still a year to go, but tonight may tell a tale as to what exactly that's going to look like. Of course, you can get more coverage, as always, on the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find that on the terminal and online.
That does it for Kaylee and I right here from the Capitol. We'll see you back tomorrow. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.